Hi, this is Andrew with the Glass Mind podcast, part of Glia Health, and I'm here with Dr. Ben Rein. How you doing?
Hello. I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for
Awesome. We're
having me.
so happy to have you. So just want to jump in right to it. You kind of talk about like where you're from.
So I'm from Buffalo, New York. That's where I was born and raised. That's where I spent most of my life. I ended up going to West Virginia University for undergrad and then coming back to Buffalo to University at Buffalo for my PhD. So altogether, I've spent all but my undergrad years in Buffalo, New York. And
Awesome. Yeah, I haven't been up east yet, but I definitely plan on going up there at some point in the future. So talk to me a little bit about your education. How'd you get involved in neuroscience?
yeah, so by the way, if you do go to Buffalo, you have to get chicken wings. There's no place that has chicken wings like Buffalo, New York. I sample them everywhere I go, and Buffalo's the best. So yeah, it's funny. I was in my undergrad in psychology, actually. And I tell this story a lot. I'm asked this question a lot: how did I end up in neuroscience? And basically, I was a psychology student and I had this crazy nightmare that just totally rocked my world and changed the way I thought about the brain. I was just amazed by how powerful the brain could be to do all this stuff, generate these images that are terrifying and also experience it on sort of this conscious level. And it's just this amazing interface of like consciousness and this ability to like generate like imagination interfacing all at once. And I was just blown away. So I literally woke up, went to class that day and talked to my professor. I was like, how do I get into neuroscience? And then I changed my major and everything and ended up in neuroscience now. So I don't have a typical, inspiring story about, someone I love was afflicted with some neurological condition. It's actually, a lot different, but I love neuroscience and, I'm very happy I ended up here.
Yeah, I almost have almost an identical story. I was a biology major in my undergraduate, and someone had recommended I take a behavioral neuroscience class, intro to behavioral neuroscience, and I was like, okay, I'll check it out. And within I think the first week of class, I was like, that's it. I'm changing my major. The whole thing. I dove straight into it, and I never looked back. And so I think that people, at least the people that I've talked to have gone to neuroscience, have a very similar experience. They'll take one class, or maybe they'll hear, one podcast lecture, and then they're just kind of sold. So
it's very compelling stuff. It's really interesting.
Yeah. So to kind of walk it back just for our viewers, my name is Andrew. I'm a founder and CEO of Glia Health, and like I said, I'm here with Dr. Ben Rein. And we kind of wanted to come together and talk about neuroscience in America and how it's affecting our healthcare field, how it's affecting just normal societal relations, and kind of not only dispel some of the misinformation out there, but also kind of look towards the future and see where healthcare and neuroscience can take us. So with that being said, I was going to ask you, doctor, how do you think that the study of neuroscience differs from mental health or psychology in your experience?
Yeah, so it's actually funny too, approaching this question, having come from a psychology background and now in neuroscience. So anyone watching this should be aware that I'm a scientist. I don't see patients. I do research experiments in a laboratory. So I don't, there's a difference between psychiatry and neurology. And here I'm talking about psychology research and neuroscience research. And it's actually, it's really interesting. And I'm not even sure if this is the question you're asking, but I'm going to answer it this way. But in psychology research, a lot of the time there's some behavioral phenomenon, right? We find that some population tends to do one thing way more than another group, and we don't know why. And psychology might try to figure out, what factors in their life contribute to those decisions and stuff like that. And looking at, the science of behavior, whereas in neuroscience, we're looking at the biology of behavior, and we'll actually move further away from human behavior and start looking at, like animal behavior and trying to understand what like neural circuits are underlying those decisions and those types of things. So they kind of go hand in hand, even though they don't interface probably enough as they should. But yeah, they ask different questions. And in neuroscience, I just find that you get to go a few layers deeper, oftentimes, at least with the questions that I want to ask. You get to go a little bit deeper with understanding not only like why is this happening, but also like if we shut off this one part of the brain, can we prevent it from happening? Or if we activate that part of the brain, can we make it happen? So it's a lot of fun in that way.
Do you think that there's a sort of like correlate just understanding how like the biological basis for our brain, our moods, and some of our behaviors. Um, you know, some people can, maybe ill-informed people or ignorant or even just well-meaning can say that, oh well, you know, I'm this way or I have this, bad personality habit because of my brain and therefore like I'm excused. I mean, do you think that there's a good case for that, or you think that the that biological basis for some of our behavior doesn't necessarily excuse bad behavior?
I guess it depends on what the behavior is. There are some things that are very much like, you're born with some, neurodevelopmental trajectory that leads to some behavioral changes in adulthood. In that sense, yeah, I've actually been thinking a lot lately about like determinism versus free will, and this is sort of this question. And I do think, you know, there's that phrase, you deal with the cards you're dealt, or whatever the phrase is. That's pretty much what it is when it comes to the brain. You are just born into this brain, and you've got to deal with however it works. So yeah, a lot of the time, I mean, absolutely. I have this hard time conveying this idea that everything about everything we do, and everything about you and your personality and your flaws and these behaviors and stuff, it all comes down to the brain, and the brain comes down to, your parents' brains and genetics and all these things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, if you're making horrible decisions on a day-to-day basis, on purpose, then I can't say that your brain is at fault. But now we're going to talking really
on some level, yeah, it would be. It's a little bit of a mixed bag, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So on that note, do you think that some of the, I guess, maybe misinformation surrounding the brain is due to like social media, or just the fact that there's so much knowledge available and there's not enough experts to maybe parse it through, or because not everyone is an expert in it and they just kind of have to take what they see and at face value? And so because we all can't be experts in everything, right? So like, I'm not a aerospace engineer, and so I kind of have to trust the guys over at SpaceX that they're building the rocket to the specifications that needs to be. Likewise, they're not, involved in neuroscience. So they have to kind of trust what the neuroscientist says to some extent, right? There's obviously some critical thinking involved, but, do you feel like social media has kind of helped educate the public more than maybe 5-10 years ago? Or do you think it's kind of been almost a hindrance to like the overall, I guess, educational growth?
Yeah. So basically there's a system of information transfer that I like to think of. So let's say if you wanted, like you making the aerospace engineering reference, let's say you wanted to learn how SpaceX builds their spaceships.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say you're not you, because you have a science background and stuff. Let's just say you're Joe, American Joe, and you're the average human being in America, and you want to learn how SpaceX builds their rockets. You're not going to go to the SpaceX website and find their blueprints and models and look up the individual parts and find out how all those things work individually and how they work as a system. That's sort of how science is, where if you want to learn something about the brain, you're not going to go to PubMed and search for research articles and read those review articles about these receptors and all that. You're probably, if you're looking for SpaceX, you're probably going to Google SpaceX, how their models work, how their rockets work, and find an article published on some media website, and you're going to learn from that. And now it's like we're playing telephone here. Someone that works for that media outlet got some information from SpaceX, translated it into what they consider interpretable language. Then someone else is reading that and understanding it in a certain way. And then let's say you have a TikTok account and you're like, wow, this is amazing. I can't believe SpaceX uses this chemical in their rockets that's carcinogenic. I need to make a TikTok. And then you make a TikTok explaining, and you got all your information from that source that's coming from that source. And that's exactly what happens with science, that people read articles that are on whatever journalism.com website, and they interpret it a certain way. And then they think that they're an expert on that topic, and they start blasting out there. So
well, it's gone through so many filters, right? It's just filter on filter on filter on filter, to where the original message has been distilled so much that it's no longer the same thing.
Absolutely. Exactly. And I've read, I don't even know what to call them. I guess articles, like media articles.
Yeah, popular science articles that written in Business Insider or Forbes or whatever. Yeah,
exactly. I've read articles like that about breaking research, and I read the article in the whatever that source is, And then I go to the actual scientific research article and I read that, and I immediately identify multiple problems with the way that the other article is written, that they didn't properly interpret it. And so now, and, you know, that's got to be frustrating for the scientists behind those studies too. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, that's not what happened. But
so what would you say to the layman, right, who is on the receiving end of that information? You know, he finds the TikTok account, he sees the video that says, you know, SpaceX uses carcinogen chemical and blah blah blah, right? Or you know, they hear a particular fact or opinion on COVID, right, for instance, or some other facet of our general health. What can they do to better insulate them from not only misinformation but disinformation, as well as any other sort of false information that kind of exists out there?
yeah. So my initial thought is, okay, make sure that your information is coming from a reputable source, right? Make sure that if you're watching Joe on TikTok, American Joe, talking about the brain, you know, who is this person? Where they get their information? Check their sources. That's a lot of work though. Or, you know, the other thing you could do is go online, read with the same articles they got their information from, track down the scientific papers. That's a lot of work. Checking Joe's credentials isn't a lot of work, but that's a lot of work. And unfortunately, I'm starting to get into this way of thinking about it where I feel like you just need to be skeptical. You just need to be cautious in general of information. And I've actually learned this lesson the hard way through my, you know, science communication, that when I first started, I would just make a video explaining some concept that I thought I understood, and I wouldn't reference the literature or double check my facts. It's like, this is the way I understand it. This is the way I'm going to present it. And then I realized a while in that that's horrible. It's a horrible way to do science communication, because I don't know if the information that I'm talking about is actually true. And if it's still accurate, you know, maybe I learned it 7 years ago, is it still conceptualized the same way? So I've always just been super reluctant to talk about anything, you know, unless I have like a scientific article right in front of me that verifies that statement. And I mean, you know, so when I say you should check, listen to reputable sources. Sorry, I have a puppy. She may be making a little noise. You know, check your sources, make sure these people are reputable. Even when you're listening to me talk, and I'm just using myself because I consider myself a reputable source, I hope that not everything I say is going to be true in 5 years. You know, science is always changing, and I'm presenting on the science of today. So you just have to be skeptical of information. And if you can, avoid taking some piece of information you're given and just start, you know, blabbing about it to people, unless you're absolutely certain that it's true. You know?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I definitely would agree with that. I think that, you know, we're all fallible, right? Even ourselves, because I have a master's in neuroscience, you have a PhD. And so, you know, I put up a TikTok a couple months ago, honestly, about multiple sclerosis. And I had one of the statements that said it's primarily characterized by nerve pain. And while there is some cases where nerve pain is associated with multiple sclerosis, it's not primarily characterized by that. It's primarily characterized by, you know, motor and sensory deficits that present themselves in many different symptoms, in many different ways. But someone called me out on it because I had messed that up. It's like, well, crap. And so I went back and reread the literature, and I was like, oh yeah, I should correct this. So I put a video to correct it. But you know, but that's because I really pride myself on the integrity of the science and the integrity of the work, and I don't want to misinform people. But not everybody is like that. Not everyone takes the responsibility like that. And so I think, you know, it's very difficult or it can be very difficult to search out reputable sources online. And if we don't put the work in, and we just kind of accept things at face value, you know, we do ourselves a disservice. But just like you said before, I totally understand. It's a lot of work. Not everybody has that time, right? If they're working their 9 to 5 and then they want to come home, relax, turn on the television or read a couple articles, you know, and then go to bed with their family, they might not have the time to kind of go through that intellectual rigor to kind of really search out the truth, which I don't really see a good way around it. I think what you said is just be skeptical, right? Don't just accept it immediately. Might be the best thing for people to do. But it's certainly an issue we're facing in the 21st century.
Yeah. And two other things regarding misinformation, specifically on TikTok. You know, we're talking about that game of telephone that people are playing. The other problem is that TikTok's designed, like you're saying, people don't want to sit down and watch TV or read an article, whatever, go to bed. TikTok is designed to save you time. You want to watch a 60-second clip, get everything you need out of it, and then swipe to the next one. So now we have people that are trying to take all the information from the article they read and summarize it in 60 seconds.
Yeah.
That's another problem. And that's even a challenge for me, even as well as I think I understand something. So that's just another point of, falsehoods arising. But the other thing that I was going to say is, TikTok's algorithm is designed to show people videos that are captivating and interesting. And a lot of the time the videos that are interesting are controversial. And I just saw, this video, I can't even remember. Oh, it was one of those videos about the doctor steps up and says, the vaccine's going to kill everybody. And this guy put the video out, and he was just sitting there looking at the video like, whoa, my gosh, this is horrible. I can't believe this. And it had 10 or 20 million views, lots of people saw it. And of course he was called out by a lot of people. He's like, people are saying you're not taking this down. This is spreading misinformation. And finally, he did put up another video where he said, I'm sorry, that was wrong. I don't want to spread misinformation, but he never took down the original video. And the new video, which is an apology, is so uninteresting.
Yeah.
Had I don't know, 50,000 views compared to the original one that had 15 million views or something like that. So it just doesn't end up having the same effect. And this is kind of like the same thing. I studied autism in my PhD, and for a lot of people, the only thing that they know about autism is that it's caused by vaccines, and it's not.
Yeah.
And that's the same type of thing. It was a false paper that was had falsified data that came out indicating that the MMR vaccine causes autism. But then, and that, that hit the news, everyone found out about it, but then the paper was retracted because it was found out that it was false, and that didn't quite hit the news. And now people still believe that. So it's tough.
Damage was done. Yeah. And I think that's what it really illustrates, how important, for better or worse, being first is, right? So there's such this rush to get the news out, to be the first one to get the news out or the article out or whatever. And, and push the intellectual integrity to the side because we got to be first. Mm-hmm. And I get that. I understand that, right? You want to make sure that you've got the eyeballs on your content, whether that's an article, a video, podcast, whatever. But in doing so, you really run a risk of damaging, public perception of a specific topic. And if you go back and fix it later, it's not going to have the same traction as that first initial impression. Yeah. First impressions really do matter. And so it's this balance of being quick and being accurate is tough. And I do think there's importance to being quick though, because if you wait too long, then someone else can show up with misinformation, and yours might actually be the correct one, but because you waited too long, they get the first impression. And so they then let the river flow where it goes, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of my TikTok content is, there's a viral video with some misinformation. I show 5 seconds of it, and then I talk for 55 seconds about why it's wrong and explaining the science behind it. And never does my video get more plays than the original. Never. The originals always hover somewhere between 500,000 plays and maybe anywhere up to 10 million plays. My videos maximum get 1 million views, and that's the best videos that I've ever had in my TikTok career. So typically those videos will get maybe 100, 200,000 plays if I'm lucky, and it's not hitting the same audience. So
do you think that with the brain specifically, or neuroscience in particular, because of how difficult or complex the brain is, it lends itself more easily to distilled down interpretations of how it actually works, and so it can be grabbed on more easily by the layman, even if those aren't necessarily correct, as opposed to say maybe other industries? Absolutely. I think the only way to understand the brain is to simplify it conceptually, even for neuroscientists. Mm-hmm. I, through my training, have slowly kind of leveled up in my understanding of the brain, and it's amazing to see, the way that it's conveyed, the way it's described by people without any neuroscience training. And it's easy to see, at one point I felt the same way. I conceptualized the brain the same way, and then I learned a lot of things and it changed, and then I learned some more and it changed. But yeah, the problem is, everyone's interested in the brain. Everyone's got one. So everyone wants to know about it. And yeah, it's, people like to ask questions like, where is love in the brain? Where is hope in the brain? Have we figured out where that is in the brain? It's no, not quite. You're asking the wrong question.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And people it's just too hard to explain. There are distributed populations of cells in one part of the brain that project to other parts of the brain, which also innervate other areas of the brain. And it's all this big circuit, and, those might control one function. It's just like, it's so complicated. So I do my best to try to explain it in fun ways, but yeah, I'm thinking about actually making like a book, like a kind of a neuroscience 101 textbook for the layman. And, but that's a pipe dream. It's going to be a lot of work if I do that. But if I do, it'll walk along that trajectory of like how the brain works and stuff.
Yeah,
that's that I want to be able to help people understand.
There's I think the 12 inches above our shoulders are probably the most fascinating bits of space that exist in the universe, to be honest. So I think if you do ever make the book, I'd love to read it or help contribute to it if possible, because I think it's definitely sorely needed.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Talking about the future, I think, where do you see the field of neuroscience in 5 years?
That's in 5 years, probably not much different, to be honest. 5 years, there'll be some big landmark papers that come out that change the way people think about, neuroscientists think about certain topics and certain systems in the brain. There might be a new technology developed that sort of expedites a certain type of research, but nothing will have really come of that yet. Probably a few technologies will come out, but beyond that, like let's say 20 years down the road, I think that there will be a lot of changes in the way research is done. I think about this a lot actually as a scientist, because if you look back 20 years ago, even at the way science and neuroscience was done and the questions that were being asked, because of the questions that were capable of being asked, because of the technologies that were available, it was super different. So I think a lot, like I'm trying my best to establish myself as a scientist and contribute something interesting to literature. And it's almost certain that whatever I do, even if I spend the next 5 years working on it and it ends up being a huge discovery, 20 years from now, it probably won't be that interesting anymore. And it'll be very elementary. But it does seem like if there's anyone out here that's interested in neuroscience, it does seem to me that the field is moving towards like big data, like bigger data, like sequencing data, stuff like that. And as someone looking for potentially a career in neuroscience, I think that having like computational skills, like doing coding, bioinformatics, those types of things, big data manipulation, those will become more commonplace skills in the field. So if you don't have those, you'll be at a whatever. I can't think of the word I'm looking for.
Finally, so to speak, yeah. Do you think that, well, with the advent of AI and artificial intelligence and deep learning models, that were initially developed after the study of neuroscience came about, and kind of how the brain, the synapses function in our brain, that kind of use those to help develop these machine learning algorithms. Do you think that maybe in the next 5 to 10 years and 15 years, we'll see new models come out that sort of further, that take the more bioinformatics approach and kind of build on that? And then also, sort of part of that question is, do you think that we'll see much more brain machine melding together, sort of like, I know we talk about or we could talk about Neuralink with like Elon Musk and kind of what they're doing over there. I don't know if you're familiar.
Yeah, I'm familiar. Yeah, I have an opinion on it. I do think that stuff is going to become more prominent. Brain machine interfaces, implanted electrodes for non-essential purposes. I'm not.
So what's an example, just for people who might not be familiar, what's an example of a non-essential purpose that an electrode could be implanted?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking that. Okay, so let me start with an essential purpose. Let's say you've lost an arm and you're going to have a prosthetic arm attached to your body. And in order to control that arm, they're going to plant an electrode into your brain, the part of your brain that controls that arm. And now you can use, that electrode will feed information to the arm. And so when you want to move your arm, it'll basically act as if it's your arm. So I consider that an essential purpose, right? You have some sort of health condition and it's addressing that. A non-essential purpose would be something like implanting electrodes into your brain so that you can access the internet remotely. You're at work and you don't have your computer on you, and okay, let me just think about it and go to Google and search that thing, and okay, now I have the answer. Or I want to message my friend or send a thought to my friend or something like that. Those purposes, I don't really like the idea of. I think if we had a full, complete understanding on the brain and how it worked, and there were really no research questions left to be asked, then I think, sure, let's do it, I guess. But there's also a lot of, the reason I don't want it now is because I don't think we should start manipulating a system that we don't fully understand. Although I do think there's a lot to be learned from integrating those systems into the brain. But the other problem is obviously, there are like sociological issues with this. It can, if it's available only to those who can afford it, then all of a sudden we have enhancements, cognitive enhancements only to the wealthy. So it can cause, a huge, an enlarged wealth gap, between. Yeah. So I have issues with it, both neuroscientifically and ethically.
Ethically, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that, yeah, that was good. It was just kind of made me think of going like, just sort of like a dystopian future, like where, there's the extreme wealthy have all these, transhumanism. There we go. That's what I was thinking of, where like, I like the idea in theory, right? But it just opens up all these problems that no one really thinks about ethically that, can create a lot of inequality.
Yeah. I'm in general, I'm excited for a lot of stuff and, neuroscience advances that are going to occur, but I'm horrified for the future in general because of things like deep fakes,
Yeah.
And that comes to misinformation. And then, well, why don't we talk about that article you sent over about the nanobots and the mind meld and stuff like that, because I thought that was really interesting and it made me think a lot.
Well, like, so what about, I mean, the from Science News?
Yeah. Do you want to, either I can, or you can give it just sort of a general introduction?
Yeah, I think you probably can give a better introduction and then we'll kind of go from there.
Okay. So there were two concepts in the article. Well, there were two that we're going to talk about. One, I think it was like nanobots or something like that. Basically, the idea was that they inject these sort of like electrode like things into your bloodstream and then use a magnet to bring them up into your brain. And then once they're in your brain, they can look around, like record electrical activity from your brain and figure out certain areas that have like deficiencies, aren't active enough or are too active, attach themselves to those brain areas and sort of restore homeostasis to your neural activity.
Yeah.
The example they used was a woman suffering from postpartum depression, and they give the nanobots, whatever, and they restored the circuit function. Certain parts of her brain weren't active enough. They restored that, and then she started feeling happy again. And then she had them removed and continued her life. And that made me think, it made me think a lot. I thought about if that were available, something like that, then we would be able to learn so much about the brain, to just put electrodes into someone's brain and they would just find out what's wrong, and then it can address that. And being able to associate those electrophysiological findings with behaviors and emotions would be enough to advance the neuroscience field so much more than what we're doing right now. Because currently we're doing those same types of studies, but primarily in animal models like mice and monkeys and stuff. And we're inching along, but that would be, and a lot of the time it doesn't translate to humans. So that would be really interesting to be able to do. The other thing,
because like the brain itself is also like certain aspects of the brain lend itself to more easy feasibility and testing, right? Some things are more like a one-to-one representation, right? Like the motor system, for instance, but
yeah,
other systems like emotional regulation or memory, right? It's not quite clear cut as to how those completely operate. So I think we've got good models, but there's still like gaps in the knowledge.
Yeah, and like let's talk about. I'm going to come up with an example. So for people who are listening to this or watching this who don't have a neuroscience background, let's say there's a study where mice and humans both share the same parts of the brain that regulate fear and regulate decision making. They actually share a lot of brain regions in common, pretty much almost everything. But so let's say there's a study in mice that finds that the projections from I forget what the part I said, fear and
amygdala and like I guess the
yeah, I'm going for like,
hypothalamus,
yeah, I was going for like amygdala and like frontal cortex or something like that. But
limbic
like,
system. I mean, yeah,
yeah, maybe so like a part of the brain that controls fear and emotion, and a part of the brain that controls like logic and like thinking and stuff like that.
your dorsal left prefrontal cortex for your logic center, and then like fear. I think of fear, I think of amygdala every time. So that's just kind
Yeah.
of what the two that I would link to kind of put them together. But
Yeah, there we go. So let's just say in mice, there's a study that finds that projections from the cortex to the amygdala are reduced in activity or increased in activity after a really terrifying experience for the mice. That might indicate that, okay, maybe in like PTSD, for example, we can target that specific circuit in humans and maybe reduce the activity. But the question is, we don't really know if that's going to work in humans. And there's very different contexts of fear. Maybe it was a fear of an odor of a fox or something like that, or maybe it was a fear of shock, a foot shock or something like that. And maybe in the different contexts, there's different brain neurons involved and brain regions involved. So there's just a lot to be figured out, and it's very stepwise in animal research. But the interesting thing too is that there is stuff like this happening already, like the brain bots thing, but not so comprehensive where you like inject it and it goes all over the brain. But there are people that already have electrodes implanted into the various brain regions, for various purposes.
There's epileptic like seizure treatment is, they use deep brain stimulation to kind of help tune down those neurons so they don't fire as much, lower the excitability.
Right.
And so I think the article was kind of, as far as a futurist article, it's pretty interesting to kind of be able to like target where you want to place those electrodes. I don't know how feasible it would be, right, without doing the current methodology we have, but maybe that's a problem for the future scientists in 50 years to figure out. But
yeah, it worries me because where there is the opportunity to make money, there will be smart people working on it.
Yeah.
And I worry that getting to a place where that technology is available, that will happen more quickly than getting to a place where we fully understand the neurocircuitry of the brain. I can almost guarantee that will happen before then. So it's just, it worries me. It's like, you don't fully understand how your car's engine's working, but we're going to start making modifications to it, just kind of hoping that it'll make it faster.
There's it's the eagerness, I think, to like press forward, especially in the way like with people's brains in terms of like expanding it or trying to not so much, I think, in our like community, but I've heard like expanding your mind, right, or expanding the brain in certain ways. Mm-hmm. And I feel like it's usually this like half-baked like press forward in the private sector to sort of create new technologies or therapies or modalities for with which we interact with the brain, and it's always not taking into account like the full knowledge spectrum that we have available for the brain. But I don't know, even saying that, and I recognize that the dangers that not doing that causes, I don't know how you would, right? I don't know how you could create an integrated technology to the brain that then interfaces wholly and completely with it.
I guess that's sort of a good point. It got me thinking that anybody who fully understands the brain enough to create something like that will work, hopefully that person will also have the same type of feeling and hesitance that I have, that this maybe isn't really something that should happen right now. Versus people who are more kind of trigger happy about it are less educated on the brain and therefore less capable of actually making it happen. So maybe there's a little bit of a rate limiting step there, and just the natural dynamics of who would approach this problem. I can only hope.
Yeah. I think some of the more interesting, well, not some of the more interesting, but some of the interesting things that have kind of happened in the past 20 years or so, maybe like 15, is kind of the advent and explosion of TMS therapy. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's transcranial magnetic stimulation. And
Mhm.
it's primarily used to teach, it's FDA approved to treat depression and anxiety. And just for the viewers who might not know what that is, it's basically where they take a big magnetic coil and they kind of place it on regions of your brain, usually the right dorsal prefrontal cortex or your left, and depending on whether it's for anxiety or depression. And it basically shoots magnetic waves into your brain to either excite or suppress that neuronal firing. Because sometimes you want to, it's not all excited neurons aren't always a good thing, right? Sometimes it's you want to lower the firing because it's overexcited. But they've reserved the treatment to patients who have been on various antidepressants and they don't work. The antidepressants work or fail, but they've seen, I think, like an 80% treatment, like recovery rate in patients with depression who utilize this TMS therapy as opposed to just medication alone. And I think some of the, I think in the next maybe 15, 20 years, we'll see more of accepted treatments utilizing this like TMS therapy, kind of that with like PTSD, maybe ADHD, and addiction as well. I think all of those are being done in studies, but they're not actually FDA approved yet. And I think soon they'll kind of get to that point. But it makes me kind of glad on one hand that we're moving, we're expanding our therapeutic horizon. So it's not just medicine. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that there are chemical imbalances in the brain, but I think it's sort of, in some respects, like shooting, you know, a shot, like it's a blanket approach, I guess. When you it's like a medicine bomb. It just takes out everything.
Yeah.
Whereas with some of the more technology-based approaches, it's more targeted.
Yeah.
And there's certainly benefits and drawbacks to both. But
yeah, and actually something that you just made me realize isn't really talked about is that people think about the brain and things like depression, anxiety as, like you said, a chemical imbalance in the brain. But ultimately, that chemical imbalance in the brain results in an electrical imbalance in the brain. Yeah. And so the same problem can be targeted through something like TMS or something like an SSRI or whatever. And yeah, that's exactly right. Because if you're taking an SSRI, anywhere, SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is treatment for depression, anywhere that's an
example of what, real quick, just to kind of cut you off. Do you have an example of what an SSRI is, like a name of a drug, for instance?
Yeah, like Zoloft or something like that. So anyone who's taking that, there are serotonin. The purpose of an SSRI is when serotonin is released from one brain cell to another, after a while, if it's not really taken in by the second cell, the first cell can already be like, give me that back. I want that back. Yeah. And SSRIs prevent that process from happening so that once it's released, it must be taken up by the second cell. So it basically, you're not adding anything to your brain. It's just sort of augmenting an existing system and making more serotonin be absorbed by neurons, essentially. So, but the problem is there's not serotonin just in the parts of your brain that regulate, mood. There's serotonin in all other places. And so when you're taking a drug systemically, when you're orally, you're just eating it and it's going in everywhere in the brain and in the body, you're going to have off-target effects. Versus, if we can target specifically one part of the brain and increase its activity or decrease its activity, it's going to, that is the actual part that you want to happen, but without the off-target effects, because you're restricting it to the specific system that it's important for. So,
well, I think that too, especially with like SSRIs or other hormonal medications, they are systemic, right? It's not just affecting your brain. So while you may get a benefit to your mood, there's also gastroenterology effects that that affect your intestines, right? And so it can cause all sorts of a whole host of other issues. So it's when doctors typically prescribe medication, there's always this balance they have to weigh. It's like, well, we save this here, but we lose a little bit this here. It's a bit of a trade-off. And so I think personally, going the electrical route is maybe, and I say this cautiously, I think it's the future. So.
I agree. And I also, I really hope so. I hope those things become more available. There's a lot of research being done on them, which is really good. Also, side note, just because this is interesting, Um, a lot of people don't know that electroconvulsive therapy is a thing that's actually effective.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks that if you've seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Jack Nicholson
Yeah.
is getting, electrified and then it fries his brain. And that's, sorry, spoiler alert. But, everyone thinks of it that way. And it's actually amazing. It's very effective for those with treatment resistant depression. And
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that, I mean, ECT definitely is not the end all be all catch all tool or like to fix everything, but
oh yeah,
it's also not the over exaggerated Hollywood depiction of like, the psych patient just strapped to the chair, like, I don't want to do this. I think there are some people who actually like, they'll talk to the doctor, like they want, like, they shock me, doc, like I need it. Give me my ECT. And so there are patients who really want the therapy, need the therapy, and it's really beneficial. So
yeah. With that said, though, it's again non-specific. This is just
yeah,
a literally induced seizure.
yeah, it's literally, yeah, it's another non-general, or what was it? It's not target specific, as you put it earlier.
Yeah. So it's whatever. But I don't know. Whatever. I'll leave that there. I'm not going to go on.
Yeah. So kind of going to continue the topic on treating brain disorders and therapies. How do you see autism being treated in the future? I may know the answer, but I'll just go and ask you, and for the viewer's sake, I mean, do you think there is a cure for autism? Will we ever solve it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I mentioned earlier, just for background, I did my PhD research in autism. I specifically studied a handful of genetic risk factors for autism. So autism is very much genetic. There are, we don't know exactly, but probably something like 1,000 different genetic mutations that can lead to autism. And it's also, it's autism spectrum disorder. So it is a spectrum. Someone once told me, and I always repeat this, once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So there's such a variety. And in that, it's not just a variety of behavioral expression, it's also a variety of, neurological changes, neurobiological changes. So, I mean, what we found in our research is that, the specific genetic model that I was studying was a portion of chromosome 16 that could be either deleted, so the entire section with like 27 genes is gone, or it can be duplicated, so you have 2 copies of all these genes. And in either direction, it can lead to autism. But maybe this isn't so surprising, but with such a closely related 2 different root causes, genetic causes for autism, there were totally different neurobiological changes in the brain. And it's, you would think, like, if anything, those would be really similar because it's the same genes being affected, but it's not. So will there ever be a single catch-all treatment for autism? No, I think that probably there will be a whole bunch of different things, if there ever is anything that becomes available. But it seems that the way it's headed, there will be certain, pharmacological treatments, like things like, things like SSRIs, like a drug that you can take that will target specific neurological systems that seem to be involved commonly in autism. And I mean, actually, just because we're on the topic, I have a paper that's in review right now that is exactly doing that with this model, that it's targeting this one system.
I look forward to reading it.
Sorry?
I said I look forward to reading it.
Yeah, I'll send it over once it's published. But yeah, I don't know. It's also tough because talking about autism is a really challenging thing. I've learned, being on social media and talking about my research, I've found that there are all different perspectives. I'll talk about autism, I'll talk about things like this, treatment approaches. And there are some people who respond to this with, holy cow, I need this, I don't care if it's FDA approved.
Yeah.
My son needs this now. And then there are other people who are, how could you even talk about treating autism? There's nothing wrong with autism. I'm grateful to have autism and it makes me who I am and I don't need to be fixed. There are all these different perspectives. And so that has no relevance to the question asked,
Yeah.
but just for anyone out there, just be aware of the sensitivity of autism, and you don't want to, I certainly, it's funny because I'm a scientist who is studying ways that the symptoms of autism can be treated, but I also totally identify with, this perspective of autism doesn't need to be fixed. And I think people need to also recognize that it's a spectrum. Some people who are on the spectrum have entirely, fantastic lives where it doesn't affect them. Some people have trouble communicating with their own family members, and those are the people who actually would want to seek out treatment. Those are the people who these types of studies are designed for, that we can help potentially create some option to enhance sociability or reduce social anxiety for people with autism. So
I definitely agree, man. It's definitely I think with any neurological disorder or condition or presentation, really, you got to be sensitive to the people who are going through it, who live with it every day. And they are in many ways invisible. For some people, it's there's autism in particular, right? Men and women display autism very differently, and there's a lot of masking that goes on with women in particular. And so there's a lot of women who have autism, but you never know it, and they don't ever, and they themselves might not even necessarily recognize they have it because it's so undiagnosed in that population. And so I think that it's, if someone reveals to you that, I have autism, or I'm on the spectrum, and they may not even necessarily, you may not believe that they have it, like, because they don't fit the typical presentation that you're familiar with. As you said earlier, you met personal autism, you met one person, just to kind of be mindful and be like, kind of accept their experience and kind of support them through it, right? You don't have to necessarily understand it wholly. So kind of, I got one more question for you, then we'll kind of go into some closing comments. I really enjoyed this interview, Ben. This was awesome. I know I learned a lot. I hope our viewers learned a lot, and listeners, and I hope we can do this again soon. But in conclusion, as a neuroscience professional, what advice can you offer someone who wants to pursue this field? Like, how do they get involved doing what you're doing? How do they make the big breakthrough?
So like you mentioned earlier, you take one neuroscience class and all of a sudden it's like, wow, I need to study this for my entire life. It can be very compelling. You should be aware before you pursue a career in neuroscience that it is a challenging career. You need to be good at a lot of different things, specifically if you're going into like academia, what I want to do, where you're a professor and you're also running a research lab. But the biggest problem I've seen is that it's such an unusual career where you don't just go and get your degree in neuroscience and then you get offered jobs as a neuroscientist. It's such everyone has a different path. So if you are interested in a career in science, specifically neuroscience, I would strongly recommend that you start using the resources around you. If you're a student, in college, I would go to your favorite neuroscience professor and go to their office hours or set up a meeting with them and talk to them about, how they got to where they are. The other thing is there's different careers, so I can't give like every answer for everything right now, but definitely use the resources. Number one thing, I was trying to remember what I was going to say. Number one thing, if you're interested in neuroscience, get research experience as early as you can. If you're a freshman in college, that's not too early. If you're a high school sophomore or senior, that's not too early either. I mean, the earlier that you can get experience, it not only looks good on your resume, but it also will really help you understand exactly what neuroscience is all about and what it's like on a daily basis. And if you're curious about how to do that, let's say you're at college, you're a college student, just go to your university's faculty page. And this also applies now if you're a high school student, find the nearest research university to you and do the same thing. Look up their, like neuroscience faculty, whatever university. And I would just scroll through there, read all their research descriptions. So these are scientists who run their own research labs. and they will all have a brief description of their research. See what sounds interesting to you. Make sure you're aware of, are these people doing research in fruit flies or in monkeys or in people? Like what's the system that's being studied here? And once you figure out a few that you're interested in, send them an email and just, introduce yourself. Say it's volunteer. You're probably not going to get paid, so don't expect that. Just say, I'd like to work in your research lab. I have this many hours available a week. Is there any opportunity for me to help you out? And just get in there as soon as you can and start learning, because you will learn a lot and talking to the people in those labs. They're all at different stages. There might be master's students, there might be other undergrads, there might be PhD students and postdocs and research techs. There might be all sorts of people that you can talk to about their experience. So you just need to get your foot in the door, really, and start learning from people who have been in your shoes and gotten to where it is that you would like to be.
Yeah,
that's the best piece of advice.
No, that's awesome. I couldn't agree more, man. So again, thank you so much for coming and joining us today, Ben. Like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
Me too.
Yeah, so this is a good opportunity for you to kind of tell the viewers like what you're involved with right now, any sort of social medias you want to plug, and where can they find you?
Yeah, so my primary social media is TikTok, although, like we talked about, there's some misinformation problems on TikTok, but if you do have a TikTok, my handle there is at Dr. So at dr.brain, BREIN. So I've hyphenated my first and last name to make it look like brain, even though it's pronounced Rein. And then on Instagram, it's the same thing, but it's doctor is spelled out at Dr. DOCTOR.brain. Wanted to have the DR, but it wasn't available on Instagram. And then, if you want to learn more about my research, you can just check out my website. You can email me. All the information's on there. It's reinresearch.com, REIN research.com. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be on here and the moment to plug my social medias.
Of course. Well, we'll link all those in the description box below and kind of make it very easy for them to find you. So to our viewer and our listeners, I hope you guys will subscribe if you learned something. I hope you got a nugget of truth here. And if you have any questions for myself or Dr. Ben, please leave a comment below and we'll kind of get back to you as soon as we can. Have a great day. Thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.